Welcome everybody. I'd like to introduce my special guest, Jasun Horsley from the Horticulture blog, and he's also an author. We're going to be having a general chat today, particularly about his latest book, which is called The Vice of Kings. So welcome, Jasun. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Let's begin maybe with, can you explain to the audience what is The Vice of Kings?
Okay. Well, it's a book that I wrote, came out in 2019. The title is taken from Aleister Crowley's The Book of the Law, particular line where he says, "Compassion is the vice of kings." And it's an attempt to map what I call the superculture, which is the underlying but also overriding or over-controlling hidden aspects, almost like a parallel universe, that I believe, based on many years of research, is subtly controlling what we think of as ordinary society. And the intersection there, in terms of trying to map this invisible world that it's not a metaphysical invisible world, it's a socio-political or parapolitical invisible world, mapping as well as I can. I mean, I started with my own family history, because my family, the Horsleys, were involved in the food industry and in geopolitics, and with the Fabian Society, a very well-known British society. I was going to say secret society, but they're not secret, but they're sort of behind-the-scenes social engineers who created the Labour Party. Anyway, there's quite a lot of intersections with my own family history with this world.
I think the Fabian Society is a kind of a classic example of hidden in plain sight, right? That they don't make a big deal about what they're doing, and for that reason, people that aren't familiar with them perhaps don't realise how powerful and influential they are.
Well, that's right, because they influence the more visible influencers. So, I mean, famous Fabians, or on the periphery Fabians, would be George Bernard Shaw, Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, not necessarily an actual Fabian, but very closely affiliated with the agendas. You could sum up, or I have summed up, the agenda of the Fabian Society as the scientific engineering of society, or the engineering of a science-based society, and the intersection there with socialism, which basically has the same end, this end of turning society into a scientifically organized state. And obviously,
so this is the modern world that we're in today, the technocratic society, and we can trace the roots of it going back probably to the late 19th century, but particularly in the early 20th century, we have the people that you've just mentioned. Obviously, Bertrand Russell. He wrote a book called The Scientific Outlook that was kind of the blueprint and manifesto for a lot of this stuff. Then you had Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, and I believe Orwell was actually involved with the Fabian Society for a while. Did I get that correct?
He again was on the periphery, but he was critical of them and of those agendas. So Orwell's a tricky customer, but I never really found any real evidence for him being complicit with any of those things. He seemed to be quite opposed to them. Doesn't mean he wasn't serving, some other agendas, or, as we know, he was a British intelligence agent. I'm on the fence about Orwell, I have to say, but he didn't pop up in my researches except as a critical voice of those things.
Well, something that strikes me about him is, he went to Eton, which is probably, the most elite private school in the world, certainly in the United Kingdom. H.G. Wells, I believe, was his tutor there for a while. Or was that Aldous Huxley was the tutor, and Wells in turn Huxley's tutor, I think. And then also Ian Fleming, James Bond, went to Eton as well. And if you look at the different career trajectories from that, the James Bond books are very capitalist oriented, right? Like, he's basically the enforcer for this banking cartel, and anyone that doesn't toe the line with the cartel gets a government sanctioned hit by James Bond. But he's always hanging out with the wealthy and powerful capitalists. Whereas Orwell, he was sort of cast himself as a man of the people. I think his political views were quite socialist, almost borderline communist, and yet he was working for David Astor. He wrote 1984 on the island of Jura, on David Astor's private hunting lodge up there. So I sort of, to bring that back to your own family, Jason, you're saying that you come from a line of merchants and capitalists in the food world, and yet they were involved with this very socialist organisation.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a false dichotomy. It really is. I mean, just as this idea that fascism is associated with right-wing movements is entirely inaccurate as an oversimplification, so is the idea that socialism is somehow incompatible with capitalism. In fact, I guess something like neoliberalism shows this kind of intersection where the two things converge if the interests are high enough, and if the perspective is far-reaching enough. Then those dichotomies become revealed to be illusory. So my family, I mean, I grew up in that contradiction. I didn't understand it as a child. I knew that we were referred to as champagne socialists, which I understood as that we were a bit hypocritical, that we espoused these socialist values while living in mansions with servants and drinking champagne and the rest of it. So, but I just saw that as a kind of hypocrisy rather than evidence that socialism is a tool of the ruling class to engineer society in such a way as to maintain their power while also maintaining the illusion of their benevolence, and that there appears to be like a long-term social engineering plan which around socialism specifically. One way that I've tried to kind of simplify it is that it increases dependency of the people on the state. So the more that you provide for the people's needs, with the proviso that you're also propagandizing those people with the media and advertising so that you're shaping those needs, that's a very important proviso, the more dependent they will become on the state. So, I mean, a recent example, I'm going to really sort of risk jumping the shark here, but with transgenderism, which can be traced back to early occult fraternities and whatnot in the late 1800s, and does intersect with someone like Havelock Ellis and the Fabian Society, that's a real flashpoint for this, because the transgender movement creates certain needs in individuals that can only be answered by complete dependence on the technology and the science and the medicine of the state. Now, that's an extreme example, but you could see this sort of socialist agenda, which is about, it's paradoxical also because it's reification of the individual and their choice, but at the same time it's creating this kind of unified dependence, infantile state that really has no autonomy and is part of a socialist ideal, which is all about collectivism. I mean, maybe that's how it is, how it all does kind of mesh together in the creation of a nanny state. A nanny police state is how I would sum it up, as in the people are made infantile and kept in an infant arrested state of development so that they're dependent on a state that can become thereby more and more dictatorial and technocratic, because the technology, of course, provides it meets all of our needs, but is being, determined and dictated by a very cold and ruthless intelligence.
Yeah, I think if you follow the threads of history back, it starts to converge on these smaller and smaller groups, and then when you look at the individuals in these groups, there's such an overlap with the occult and the transgenderism. We've spoken before about the Urania movement of the late 19th century, which was basically recognizing a third gender. But to the point you're just making about the nanny state, they've sort of achieved, the LGBT movement achieved acceptance and gay marriage and everything like that, with T being put up there amongst the L and the G and the B. But that wasn't enough. So they've since progressed to now, I think Facebook recognised 75 different genders. So you could be homosexual, bisexual or transgender, but still that doesn't quite qualify it. There's all these other ones to say. And it sort of seems getting to a point of ridiculousness, and you wonder why. But I think that you've actually hit the nail on the head of why. It's this infantile dependence on Big Brother, on the nanny state to tell us what's what. And who's to say that someone is or is not a two-spirit, for example, to pick one of the genders that I still struggle to understand what that means. Like, how is a two-spirit different from a bisexual, and how is a queer different from a homosexual? And there's sort of arbitrary divisions that really don't make a lot of sense and seem to be completely unnecessary. And yet it's also being used to push in this agenda of cultural Marxism, where the most marginalised minority groups in society have to be treated as complete equals with everybody else in society, and their needs have to be put at the forefront of the majority group, which again to me seems like an illogical structure. But the reason for the structure, I think, is this dependence, and I think that this socialism is presented as a veneer, and this is what I see. I'm a pretty right-wing guy myself, but when I look at the movements in the left, this is what I see, that they're pandering to the masses, and they're saying, well, rich people are evil, everything bad in your life is the fault of rich people, the government is good, the government would never do anything bad, and the government will give you free things, So don't vote for the rich political party, vote for the socialists, because we give you the free stuff, and we're on the side of the people, we're looking out for you. But in fact, it's just all the same bankers, and they're just choosing these different actors to play the parts in their stage production.
Sure. Yeah, and to come back to an Orwellian maxim, this is that people can be convinced that 2 + 2 = 5, then basically you have them. I think that what you're describing there, with all of these identities that are being created, manufactured, and promoted and advertised for people to select, like in a supermarket where you've got 100 choices of toothpaste. I mean, you might spend 10 minutes trying to pick which washing detergent to buy, because it's been so complexified. This is, by the way, is an example, or it's a historically known thing, observable fact, that cultures in decline, very advanced cultures, before or during their decline, they become overly complexified. And so I think we say that it's a combination of something that's top down and something that's bottom up, i.e. something that is actually being managed, social engineered, with a conscious agenda over centuries, perhaps, certainly over decades, and something that's happening organically. The more confused and fragmented society, as in individuals, become, you could see how that would snowball. So people are being offered, they've got this sense of dysphoria, unhappiness with their own bodies and with their own lives, but they've been conditioned over the years from birth onwards to look to society and the state to offer solutions, even if it's just entertainment, which is a relief. And that what they're looking to is providing these identifications, these categories, these ways to relieve their distress. Then they try them on, and they don't ever fit. As you say, nobody knows what a twin spirit is. Nobody knows what a transgender is. A woman. These things don't. And then now you're saying the 75. We don't even know what they are. I mean, it's become absolutely absurd. But it's also with an intention and with this snowballing effect. As in, the more people are given false solutions to their problems, the more desperate they'll become, the more disconnected, the more those problems, that fragmentation, those split identities will proliferate. So we have, I guess, as above, so below. We've got individuals who are fragmented and turned into multiple personality by the trauma-based engineering of society. And then you have a whole society that represents that, split into these endless alters that are battling for dominance.
Yeah, and now we're moving into a world where people are going to merge their brains with computers, and the potential lifespan is going to go well beyond 100 years. We're going to have these sort of hybrid robot organic people, but we're no less confused. In fact, in this world, we're going to be more confused with artificial intelligence, feeding us information targeted towards this profile. So they fit you into a box, and then they give you the information for the people in that box, and that's sort of your view of reality. And I think that this kind of control of the population through information is something that's been developed by these social engineers all the way from the beginning, right? I mean, it wasn't just about the occult; it was also about propaganda. And the influencing of behaviour through information.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question or consideration, isn't it? It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, as in forbidden knowledge and why it's forbidden. You know, is ignorance bliss? Is knowledge a curse? Well, both. It's both and, isn't it? Ignorance can be blissful, but it's also makes us easy to control. Knowledge can be a curse, but without it, again, you know, we don't have the tools. So, and I think presumably in history there was a turning point or a tipping point when controlling you know, socially engineering large populaces became harder and harder to do by keeping them in ignorance with the printing press and so on since then. And so there may have been a shifting strategy which became more about, well, how can we disseminate the knowledge and the information in such a way that it will have the same effect, i.e. enslave people, as ignorance does. And so you and I certainly were born into a time in which real slavery was, you know, outlawed. So we were born with the belief that, you know, there were no slaves, and we certainly weren't slaves, but also that, you know, knowledge was available to us even before the age of the internet. It was a feeling of being in an information democracy. I mean, state secrecy, we've always been aware of that, but still, like, everyone could educate themselves if they wanted to, or get a good education, in quotes, haha, and so on. But in my own life, I was just writing about this today, actually, I really had to see how much knowledge has been a burden to me rather than the means of my liberation, which I always assumed it would be. And I think that actually occultism is a very, for me, actually, that's my core criticism of and distrust of occultism, having been an occultist more or less for many years, is that it's a knowledge-based system based on the predicate that knowledge is a means of power and that power leads to freedom. Well, I don't believe that. I think that's actually a basic lie that is described in the Garden of Eden, you know, the story of Genesis, albeit in somewhat, you know, obviously simplified terms, but the way to wholeness isn't through some system of gathering symbolic knowledge and then applying it for our empowerment. That's the way that the ruling class have exploited knowledge to control us. And I think we're at the stage where they have trained us to become our own prison guards, and we will oppress others with the use of this occult knowledge. But by doing so, we will become also oppressed by it, because it doesn't lead to freedom, in my opinion, knowledge.
Mm. Well, you mentioned before the printing press, and I think before the printing press, basically the priest class was in charge of information. You know, only priests were taught Latin and taught how to read and write books and had access to books. And then after the printing press, you know, this knowledge could become more widespread, as could reading, just the ability to take in and absorb knowledge from different sources. But, you know, I sort of see this technocratic society as a response to that, where they, you know, they're trying to create a new priest class, and the new priests are scientists. But it's scientism, which is the worship of scientists, rather than an actual science-based society, because science is objective. It's based on things that can be repeated in experiments and that everybody can agree with. But what we're seeing in society is things like, well, climate change. You know, we need to have a new tax because the climate changes. And then when you actually drill into the science that they're forming the basis of these opinions on, it's faulty science. You know, there's data being faked. There's, you know, huge amounts of argument within the scientific community, but yet it's presented to us by experts. And then there seems to be this whole world of people in social media that come to enforce the messages of these experts and to ridicule anyone that isn't towing the line intellectually and ideologically.
Yeah. Well, there's a difference between the scientific method and science as an institution, and indeed as an ideology, which, as you say, that becomes scientism. And one way I would sum up scientism would be the worship of knowledge. And it seems as though very quickly the worship of knowledge turns knowledge into something that imprisons us and something that isn't. I mean, it's mission creep. Like, the more we worship knowledge and the more we think that all there is to experience is knowledge, that everything can be encapsulated under this rubric of science, the more distorting that picture becomes. Because it's actually, I mean, I've tried to write about this, it's very tricky, but I mean, there are two approaches we could see as contradictory or as complementary. One is the scientific method, which is the use of knowledge and trial and error, and the other is divine revelation. And in a certain sense, they both contain their own limits, because the scientific method, by its own terms, you have to recognize that one can't apply logic, one can't apply the scientific method to the all-inclusivity or the total, sufficiency of the scientific method itself, if you see what I mean. Like, the scientific method dictates that we recognize that the scientific method is limited. And in the same way, divine revelation, you say, well, we can receive something direct from God or from, our own souls or from some transdimension, however we want to term that. But if we try and turn it into knowledge, then we will have already, we'll already be one step removed from the revelation, which is in every moment. So both of those processes or those procedures are limited, but I do think they can work together in a way that's complementary. What we've seen, I think, is kind of the opposite of that. We've seen this dichotomy or this split between the scientific method and divine revelation, and they compete with one another. And so divine revelation becomes religious dogma, it tries to be a science, and scientific method becomes scientism, it tries to be a religion. And I think, actually, it's very fascinating to me, I think occultism is that. Even Crowley said it, its aim is science, its method is religion. Magic is actually the convergence of those two distorted or perverted versions of science and religion, I would say.
Interesting perspective. So in your own upbringing in an aristocratic family, do you remember sort of your first exposure to the occult? Was it something that was just kind of accepted with your parents and their peers?
No, it wasn't. I mean, I have to speculate now, like, what were they getting up to? Where are they getting up to stuff? Certainly if we include early experimentation with psychedelics, which was central to Fabian Society, obviously Huxley, but prior to Huxley, Havelock Ellis. I wonder, was my grandfather into that? And so then that does open up all kinds of possible doorways. But I honestly don't know. Like, I've got no hard evidence or even good clues to suggest that occultism was being practiced in my family, which leaves me with, and I think in a way this is quite fitting because it makes it easier for others to relate to anyway, my introduction to occultism at a conscious level, and unless I'm forgetting something, I mean, I could say Marvel comics, actually, I could say Marvel superhero comics, but then we're really painting with a wide brush, but more concretely would have been David Bowie, the album Hunky Dory, which I first heard at the age of 11 or something, and he sings about Aleister Crowley's uniform of imagery and Himmler's sacred dream realm, and so on and so forth. Many viewers will know that song and Bowie's involvement in the occult. But anyway, I mean, that's what I realized about looking back about how occultism infiltrated my psyche, was through the culture at large. With my family, I think it's a case, and this is what I try to map with Vice of Kings, is that occultism isn't just a methodology or a set of beliefs. It's an ideology, which is a set of values. And even, I didn't quite get into this with Vice of Kings because I've more recently realized this, it's also an aesthetic. So it's actually it's like plutonium that spreads throughout society. So if we think of occultism as people doing rituals, then we limit it unnecessarily. And as I say, I saw no evidence. I have no memories of anything like that in my family. But if I think of it as an ideology, such as you mentioned, the Iranian society, the intersections between occult philosophy and the promotion of homosexuality, pedophilia in the 1970s, and then transgenderism, then that intersects very visibly today with liberal progressivism as it's become, with LGBT and all that stuff. And so that was very visible to me when I was growing up. Like pedophiles, or at least one pedophile was invited into the family home. Apparently I shouldn't say molested because that would put it too strongly, but apparently he was groping my knee under the table, and the family there found it funny. Now, I don't remember that, but I remember it as an anecdote. Oh, that time the pedophile, felt up Jakey's knee, ha ha ha. Well, obviously that's a very disturbing anecdote, and it becomes much more disturbing that they were laughing about it. I'm not saying they were sinister, just very, very naive, misinformed, and culturally, ideologically indoctrinated in such a way that they were blind to the implications of something like that. And I think that that's really helpful to be aware of this, that, I mean, occultism means hidden, doesn't it? And another way that things are hidden, perhaps the principal way, is that they're unconscious. So a lot of what was going on in my family background, I think, was unconscious. And although I would guess that the were practicing occultists in the traditional sense, or the most concrete sense, and they were also practicing pedophiles, or both, and that they had access to me and my siblings, that may have simply been the kind of environment, ideologically and socially, that my family was part of, was naively allowing them access to me. I honestly don't know, how conscious my family was of any of this.
Right. Was there a sort of a waking up moment for you where you sort of wanted to distance yourself from your past or your upbringing?
There've been several. I mean, there's the usual one in adolescence. I knew I wasn't going to join my family business. My father had no illusions about that. But more dramatically and concretely, at the age of 24, I disinherited my family fortune. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I basically just got rid of it all and went off to Morocco with no money and just a few books, one of which was an Aleister Crowley book, rather ironically, and disappeared. I didn't tell my family where I was going, and I said I probably wouldn't be back. So, I mean, it was a very archetypal kind of Siddhartha thing, combined with that, cutting all ties, and clearly a semi-conscious but mostly unconscious level. I was trying to get free not only of my family, but of the contaminating taint of the money, the blood money that I'd inherited.
And what makes you think that the money was tainted?
Well, it was kind of literally blood money, in the sense that Northern Foods, which started as Northern Dairies by my grandfather, was built into a much bigger corporation by my father. In its heyday, or when I was growing up, it was providing, I think, a quarter of the meat to McDonald's. So, a large livestock slaughter industry there was part of its dealings. And I was a vegetarian, as a teenager. But in more symbolic, less obvious, literal ways. But I didn't know this at the time. So, as I said, it was largely unconscious then. Northern Foods is linked to Marks and Spencer's, which is linked to the Zionist movement. Has funds the Zionist movement, like the various presidents, if that's the right word, or CEOs of Marks and Spencer, have been Zionists. I think the last name is Israel. So the family business was clearly proactively supporting that movement. The Fabian Society. I mean, it's all mapped in Vice of Kings, but it's always a risk, like the 6 degrees of separation. I mean, one of the flashpoints I use in Vice of Kings is Jimmy Savile, who probably most of your viewers know about, the infamous DJ who was one of the shaping influences in rock and roll, and just after he died was revealed as the most promiscuous and prolific predator in history, really.
If I could just interrupt you there for a second, just because something that the audience may not be fully aware of, and I've got a lot of Americans, but when I was a kid, I lived in England for a young time, actually in Yorkshire, in Harrogate, and I remember the TV show Jim Will Fix It, right? So this guy Savile, he really presented himself as a man of the people in this show. He was getting down, helping ordinary people, sort out their problems and their lives. And at the same time, he was mingling with the highest levels of society, the royal family, but also celebrities and politicians and business leaders and things like that. So it just seems like an example of what we were talking about earlier, of that socialism being a veneer, that he presented himself as a man of the people so that he could actually prey on the people.
Yeah, and Jim Will Fix It was for children, so throw into the mix there that he was this beloved figure of children, and Jim Will Fix It was actually a honeypot, we could say, for children that would come on the show and sit on his knee, and he would fulfill their fantasies, and then after and backstage he would rape them or sexually abuse them. So anyway, I mean, that's Jimmy Savile, very much a microcosm of something. And British culture, we could say, the hidden aspect of it, this parallel world that I'm talking about, the superculture. So my family, I mean, I don't know how well they knew Jimmy Savile, if they knew him at all. I know my father got his autograph for my sister, and I know that Jimmy Savile's famous run from I forget it, Land's End to John Oates or something like that. Anyway, he did the famous run. He did it twice across the UK for charity, and Northern Foods, it might have been Northern Dairies at that time, I forget, but no, Northern Foods funded that run. So there was a Northern Foods van behind Jimmy Savile for the whole duration of that run. Every time he wanted a swig of milk or a sandwich, well, my family's business fueled him. They literally fueled that run. Now, what's in a metaphor? It's a literal truth, but also maybe it's metaphorical. I don't know. As I say, this is the question that's still burning for me. Most of my family members are dead, and those that are alive and that know about what I'm doing, they're not commenting, and they're pretending it's not happening. The only feedback I got from my uncle, whose name is Chris Haskins, Baron Haskins, he was Tony Blair's rural czar, so very highly placed. After his stint with Northern Foods, he became the chairman after my father got pushed out. Anyway, I write about him in the book because he's linked with various social engineering think tanks. So he seems like if anyone in my family would be fully consciously complicit with what I'm writing about, it would be him. The word I got back from him was he wasn't bothered about what I was writing because nobody would read it anyway. So, I mean,
right. Well, that's definitely not a denial, is it?
Right.
So, what's the connection in your mind between what Savile was doing and what Aleister Crowley was kind of preaching and promoting?
Well, I do juxtapose them in Vice of Kings. Like, the first part is not exactly about Jimmy Savile, but he pops up consistently throughout, as I say, as a sort of microchipped eel that I try and follow through British society and culture from the 50s to date. And specifically the what came out after his death as a sort of snowball effect or domino effect around the Islington child care homes, how there was institutionalized child abuse going on in those care homes. Essentially, as I see it anyway, those care homes, and this wouldn't have been restricted to Islington, but it was most fully revealed in Islington. Those care homes were really fronting as child brothels, and Jimmy Savile was known to frequent those care homes, as in he would go there and pick up children from them. The children would wait in terror for the Jimmy Savile taxi to arrive, and then he would take those children wherever he took them. as a procurer. He wouldn't just have been abusing them himself. He would also have been taking them to high-level, MPs, politicians, royals, who knows who all else, celebrities, entertainers, and so on. So there's that, that going on. Where Crowley comes in, and why I made part 2 about Crowley, is a little more difficult to sum up, because it's more, again, to do with the ideology, the philosophy behind organized child abuse, and how that seems to be encoded into Crowley's occultism's Thelema. It's in the Book of the Law, not sex with children, but child sacrifice. Anyway, other things. It's in Crowley's life, particularly the period at the Abbey of Thelema, where one of his children died, where he writes in his journals, his magical journals at that time, about giving infants cocaine, about including them in magical rituals, and poetic descriptions of raping and torturing those children as part of a magical ritual. There's also the famous passage in Magic in Theory and Practice, in which he writes very seriously and sincerely and in detail about the efficacy of animal or human sacrifice, and ends on the point that child sacrifice is the most effective, and why, and then makes the joke, quote unquote, that he himself sacrificed a child on a regular basis for this many years, turning out to be thousands of children, I believe. Now, this is well known, or frequently alleged to simply have been Crowley's wicked sense of humor. He was talking about masturbation, and I always believed that. But in Vice of Kings, I present the evidence that it may not simply have been a joke, but may have been his own encoded way of tipping his hand to something and signaling other initiates that this was a legitimate practice and that he himself practiced. So then I get into, when I say evidence, I think there's evidence in the text itself, but there's also evidence in the life of Crowley, not just the Abbey of Thelema, but his connections to British intelligence, his hosting of black masses slash sex parties for the rich and famous, his being employed in the age-old tradition of gathering compromising material on powerful people so that they could be controlled, his participation in the murder of children, which is very hard, obviously, to find real evidence of, but I certainly find testimonies to that in a book by Robert Bryans called When the Dust Never Settled, which pertains to Crowley's friendship with Lord Tredegar, a very little known British aristocrat who held black mass at his mansion on a regular basis, and Crowley participated in those black masses, and children were known to go missing, and so on and so forth. So, for the Crowley acolyte, the Crowley follower, or the Thelemite, all of this is smoke without fire and hysteria, and of course they refuse to look at it at all, or they're just lying. It's you have to take your pick there. I've certainly had a run-in with a few of them, including Peter Lavender, but I would say that it's a pretty compelling body of evidence that Crowley's life involved a similar sort of complicity with these programs of organized child abuse, ritual sacrifice, which are central to the maintenance of the superculture, and even the philosophy and the methodology of occultism, and they also intersect, as probably will come no surprise to you, with what has become better known with MK Ultra and the use of applied trauma to fragment psyches and to unleash psychic forces, to channel entities. Who knows all what goes on in occult rituals, that involve ritual abuse and torture and murder of children. But it seems as though it's not just about sadistic predators getting their jollies. There does seem to be some very dark methodology behind it.
Yeah, it brings up a couple of interesting points for me. One is basically the parallels between Crowley, Jimmy Savile, and also Jeffrey Epstein, that it's the same type of high-level compromise operations. And there's a sexual component to it. There's a blackmail and compromise component to it. And then there's also this, creating the hidden, the invisible structure of society. By these very powerful people getting away with these horrific things, and the people that are the victims of it, they see that and they know that, and they know that they're powerless. So it's sort of that learned helplessness stuff. And then also the idea that Crowley and what he was doing was kind of like a precursor to MK Ultra, and this knowledge of how they basically break people down so that they can be controlled. I heard an interesting story from my brother, he's a conservationist, and he goes to Nepal to build elephant enclosures and stuff like that. And he told me that basically the British in the Opium Wars, they learned how the mahouts would train an elephant, which is that they basically torture these elephants when they're babies and treat them horrifically badly, so that their personality is blocked. And then after that, they never even need to chain the elephant up. Because its spirit has been completely broken, and so that knowledge, coming back from the Orient, was combined with drugs as well. And you can see how sleep deprivation, losing your kind of sense of what's normal because your senses are being overloaded with these chemical psychedelic stuff, and then the ritual component, the imagery and the symbolism. You got to wonder how much of that is really just designed about the mind control. Then you also have Crowley's influence on L. Ron Hubbard, and the foundation of Scientology, and the sort of the parallels between a lot of the experiments and thinking that were going on with MK Ultra and what Scientology was doing. I've heard it called MK Ultra without drugs.
Yeah.
So you haven't found a specific or direct connection between Savile and Crowley, but it's just sort of can be inferred from the behaviour and the connections to elite British society.
Yeah, and it's a question of influence as well. It's like modelling behaviour. So I think that they both fit a certain type if looked at through a certain lens, a lens of the awareness of exactly what you were just summing up there. Then somebody like Jimmy Savile, obviously with Jimmy Savile, we found out the truth. So then you look back over his behavior, his dress, his jokes, his values, and little hints, all the rest of it. You look back over that and you see, okay, so he was the Fabian wolf in sheep's clothing, actually. The sheep was pretty raggedy, right? He didn't ever really look like a sheep, but it was enough that the people who've already been traumatized and mind controlled in this way, and cultured in such a way that they're not really firing on all their neurons anyway, it was enough that people kind of believed it, even though now they say, I always knew there was something wrong there, right? But so when you look back with the full knowledge, or at least sufficient knowledge to change the context, then you see that Savile was something very different. So I did the same with Crowley, right? And in that way, I think they model a similar kind of character. And actually, my brother is a leading character in my novel too. My book. I guess that was a Freudian slip, but viewers won't know who my brother is unless they follow my work, because he was never famous outside of his own hunting ground in Soho, but he was called Jasun Horsley. He died in 2010, and he was a dandy in this tradition, a very famous British tradition, dandy, men who dress up to the nines. I mean, Oscar Wilde is famous as a dandy, but my brother rejected him as a dandy. But Quentin Crisp was another example, and my brother was crucified in the Philippines. He slept with many prostitutes, thousands of prostitutes. He became an escort himself. He was a heroin addict. Obviously, that was what killed him in the end. He had a kind of lifestyle that he glorified through his public persona that was overtly Luciferian. He dressed in these red suits with red nail varnish and the big top hat, kind of Jack the Ripper crossed with Satan. Aesthetic is the aesthetics of occultism. And anyway, so and he was my older brother, and that was one of the first clues, or perhaps in a way the first clues when he died. Even though I'd seen it coming, one of the ways I'd seen it coming was that he had become a caricature of himself. He'd become this sort of distorted cultural Frankenstein's monster of all these different influences cobbled together into this garish, kind of freakish public personality that eventually had destroyed him, and his family, we watched it destroy him. The more of a celebrity he became, the closer he became to self-destruction, until at the end he'd written an autobiography, Dandy in the Underworld. Stephen Fry, who I write about in Vice of Kings, had opted the rights to make the film. There was a play about his life, and that was when he self-destructed on heroin. So anyway, seeing all that up close and personal compelled me to go back to the roots of my brother's life, to see, what the initial seeds of that self-destruction were, and that led me to my grandfather on my father's side, the Fabian Society, and this whole occult generation of a Luciferian personality or orientation that is throughout our culture, and that does inevitably lead to crashing and burning in this very dark and sort of not glamorous but dramatic way.
It seems to be something that's maybe glorified by the culture. I just want to address a couple of comments from the chat. One is Rupert Fellows pointing out that Crowley was a heroin addict as well. So interesting coincidence there. And then you mentioned Jack the Ripper, and Mad About the Goy posed a few minutes ago that Jimmy Savile was perhaps either the Yorkshire Ripper or connected to the Yorkshire Ripper. And then there's been allegations that Crowley himself was Jack the Ripper, or that he facilitated the murders of Jack the Ripper for a member of the royal family. I don't know, you have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, it's a tangled web we weave, isn't it? There's a lot of room for speculation. I think that one of the pitfalls that I have to be aware of anyway in this work is joining dots prematurely or literalizing things that don't need to be literalized. And so whether or not Crowley was consciously complicit with Jack the Ripper murders, I've never heard that. The point is that there is a shared aesthetic, there's a shared ideology, there's a shared methodology, and there's a shared agenda, I believe. Now, what that agenda is and how far back it goes is the question, because I think that one of the traps, again, to repeat myself, that we fall into as researchers is a trap created by the very, or is intrinsic to the very agenda that we're mapping, and that is to come up with a conspiracy theory, in quotes, with a model, with a narrative that is incomplete, is premature, that defines and diagnoses the problem in a very us and them capacity. So we've got Crowley, we've got Savile, we've got Jack the Ripper, we've got H.G. Wells, we've got Aldous Huxley, and so on. But they're over there and we're over here and we're the victims of it. Well, in my experience, in my life, there's no way I could do that because it was my own family. And so then, and the only way I was really able to check in this was to look at my psyche. And I began this with Seen and Not Seen, in which I write about my own trauma, my own childhood trauma, but also with the diagnostic evidence, which is that as an adolescent, I found myself being aroused by imagery of violence against women.
We'd be talking about Jack the Ripper and the Yorkshire Ripper, and you're saying how, as researchers, we've got to be careful that we can come up with these hypotheses and, working theory that seems to explain everything, but, there's also, the danger of confirmation bias, that we want it to be the truth because it's our theory, but quite often we don't have all the information, and, the actual truth incorporates all the information.
Yeah, well, I don't know what point I got cut off. It was interesting timing, because I was going into much more personal stuff, and I do think it's much rarer to find researchers willing to look at themselves and put themselves under the microscope, and I think that's when the research really, when the rubber hits the road, and it becomes something that can actually be integrated and applied in life, because it starts becoming something real and not just another story out there. And so anyway, that's just a sort of intro for what I was starting to talk about when we got cut off, which is how one of the first tip-offs in my life, many years after I'd been researching all of this stuff on an out there level, but one of the first tip-offs that I had been infiltrated and recruited myself into this kind of superculture was this predilection I had as an adolescent for very dark sexual imagery of violence against women. Now, that was something that I didn't understand at the time, and I got over it, or I consciously just stopped doing it, stopped watching that material, because I felt it was harmful, or at least immoral. It was only many, many years later, again around the death of my brother, I started looking back over my life, and I started questioning, where did that come from, And 2 books later, with Vice of Kings, I realized, and I tried to present with that work, an alternate model for understanding society to conspiracy, which is complicity. It's manufactured complicity. So I'm not saying there isn't a conspiracy, obviously, I mean, there are many. I think more and more I'm starting to realize that word may be a trick and a red herring, because so much of it isn't secret, and so much of it can't be called criminal either, because it's the people who are creating the laws who are committing these crimes. So who's to say they're crimes? So what's in a word? I think even the word conspiracy itself might not accurately describe what we're talking about when we're talking about top-down manipulation of society and culture and individuals and large populations. Not questioning that happens and exists, it does, but the way that it works and how it's proceeded, based on my own experience, is by infiltrating us like a virus. Although I'm not even sure viruses are real, but that's a metaphor, takes over our system, takes over our consciousness, and thereby recruits us into its programs, at which point, which really would be, at a point very soon after birth, really, but as a result of which, we become agents of the very thing that we're supposedly identifying as this conspiracy. So then that means potentially as researchers, and I think you can see this in a literal way with, and I am somebody who mentions names, somebody like Peter Lavender or Whitley Strieber that I write about in Prisoner Infinity, researchers who actually appear to be exposing machinations, but are in fact serving to perpetuate the very kinds of delusion, disinformation, fear, disempowerment, confusion, obsession, whatever else it is, that they're supposedly exposing, because of the way it's being framed. It's not necessarily helping any of us as individuals understand ourselves better in the context of this scientifically engineered, from the moment we're born, we're stamped and we're owned, to the moment of death, our bodies are actually possessed by the state, by the scientific state, and our psyches are colonized. So that means that our instruments are very compromised when it comes to understanding this material. So my sense increasingly has been always to refer back to my own personal history, my memories such as they are, what I can verify, and specifically to my body. I would say that the real body of evidence about what's going on in our lives and in the world is in our own bodies, because that's where the trauma is. And the real secret that protects itself isn't some out there conspiracy, it's the trauma that's in our own body, because it's an intelligent trauma. It is similar to a computer virus or program that's been installed in us that then runs our hard drive, because it generates imagery, emotions, physiological responses, sensations in our body that determine our behavior. So we become like organic robots. And so how do you undo that? Well, understanding the nature of the world that's configured that trauma definitely is part of it. But I would say that as a mirror, like, to understand that what we're seeing in the world is mirroring something that's been put in us. And the reason to see it isn't to start looking at the world and get stuck on the world and think about changing the world or judging the world, but to turn attention 180 degrees, or to allow the attention to reorientate towards the trauma that's in my own body and release it. And that I think is the only thing that works. And presumably, I mean, over time, for me, that changes the configuration of my own psyche, so that changes how I see what's going on in the world or what's going on historically. So yeah, Aleister Crowley, Jack the Ripper, Jimmy Savile, yeah, really bad, horrible individuals for sure, but also carriers of a virus, to use that metaphor again, that has infected us all, who were more advanced in the stages of degeneration. So in that sense, they're more useful to study, but also more worthy of our pity. You know, they're more, can't really say more victims exactly, but they're more destroyed, more contaminated than you or I. And so, I mean, I try to get to this in Vice of Kings, the thing in the gospel about evil must come into the world, but woe unto those through whom it comes. Well, yeah, they are whatever we're going to say. I mean, they condemn themselves through their actions in a certain way, but for the rest of us, there's a lot that can be learned from that. And I would say primarily it's there, but for the grace of God, go you or I. We all have that in us.
It's a fascinating perspective, and you know we see mimetic warfare going on in social media on a frequent basis. And this is a meme is like a gene, right? It's the idea that, well, ideas themselves can spread almost biologically. And then going further, like what you're saying about this virus is perhaps a little bit more complex than a meme, but you know, there's a type of thinking that took over Aleister Crowley's mind and possessed him and drove him to do those things. And that type of thinking perhaps was just spontaneously generated and entered in his mind one day, but perhaps was, you know, fed into it. It found its way into his mind from his own upbringing, from his own experiences, from some of the institutions that he went to, such as Cambridge, where it's perhaps more enshrined. And you know, the mental virus goes in his mind, infects him, and then gets transmitted out through his work, and then infects the minds of others. And then you're saying earlier about David Bowie singing about Aleister Crowley brought Aleister Crowley to your attention, and you wanted to learn more about it. And you know, there's many other rock and roll musicians that also sung about him and promoted him, who are there spreading the virus. And you know, they may consciously think Aleister Crowley's a great guy and a wonderful philosopher, and what I'm doing by promoting his works is only helping the world. When in fact the virus may be, like you say, going right back to the Garden of Eden itself, that evil is the virus, and possibly having any knowledge at all is evil. You know, that's one way to read that story.
Well, that is one way to read it, but of course then that gives rise to the shadow, which is Gnosticism, you know, flips it over, and then you have the serpent as the good guy and God is the bad guy. And I've been thinking about this recently, that this idea that you've got the good cop and the bad cop in the Garden of Eden, cop being COP, the central organizing principle. So you've got the god, the supposed god, or the Elohim. They've organized the garden. It's a walled garden. So there's nature, but it's contained in such a way that it's not too wild. But then this other element enters in, which is the serpent, and that has a different idea about how to organize things. So it nominates itself as a counter central organizing principle, whispers in the ear of Eve, you shall be as gods, and everything goes to shit thereafter. But the solution isn't, oh, we should never have eaten the apple, we need to go back to ignorance and innocence, even if that were possible, because it's not either or. I mean, the good cop isn't entirely good and the bad cop isn't entirely bad. They work together. And it was like I was saying about magic and religion and science, isn't it? Potentially they can work together, but the danger is they come into competition. And I think that's what happened. We see in that metaphor of the Garden of Eden, there's something where these two principles, for whatever reason, they became competitive rather than collaborative. And because of that, the serpent tried to preempt its orders and oust the Elohim, the gods. And so it gave knowledge to us prematurely, to Adam and Eve prematurely. And I think that's the rub. I think that I'm certainly not saying that knowledge is evil per se. I'm not sure what evil is, but if knowledge is given, and that goes back to my point about the printing press and the changing methodologies of social control, if knowledge is given prematurely in such a way that people can't apply it, understand it, internalize it in a good way, then it will unbalance them. It will corrupt them. So then, I mean, that's what we've got now, isn't it? And that's the danger with the research we do. How many people get unbalanced by finding out this stuff, and how much of that is intentional?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I've seen it following the QAnon movement, where it's just been waking up millions of people worldwide, and I think people there coming from a pretty lowly informed base. This is people learning for the first time that the government doesn't have their best intentions at heart, or that mainstream media isn't telling the truth. I think to experienced researchers, those things are just obvious on the face of it, but I think for many people that's been a revelation. And then as they start to question things like, well, if the government doesn't tell the truth, then what does that mean that 9/11 wasn't Osama bin Laden? It was just like a way to go steal a bunch of oil, and all those people died and they lied? Like, wow. And I've seen some of my friends go through this, and they have cognitive dissonance. It's just because in order to wake up and embrace at least my version of the truth based on the information that I have, they need to reject their own previous worldview that's been built up and challenge everything in it. And a lot of people can become quite lost in that process. I mean, for me, it's sort of been happening over my whole lifetime. And, one of the hardest things to accept was this involvement of the elites in, Luciferian occult activities and child abuse activities. It just seems so shocking. But now so much of it has come out as evidence. That this has actually happened, and we see with Epstein that it's still going on today. And I don't think it stopped because Epstein either killed himself or was murdered or is still alive and living his life out on a kibbutz somewhere. None of his operations, I don't think, have stopped in any way. I think that it's just all moved on to different people. I mean, we saw with the Nexium cult, extremely Epstein-like operation, also doing the Luciferian stuff. They had a patent on how to determine if someone is a Luciferian. So that's a way for them to do their own grooming and recruitment. Who can be elevated to the higher level of the cult? Well, that's the psychopaths who will do anything without feeling remorse. And Nexium seems to have been like a massive, on one side, recruitment tool to filter and identify the useful idiots to rise to the top, and on the other side, a compromise operation. So I want to go back to something that you mentioned before about your brother. You said that he was crucified in the Philippines.
He went there during the Easter period when the Filipinos themselves have a crucifixion ritual which anyone can sign up for, and he he managed to bribe, as a foreigner, he managed to bribe them, pay them so that they would let him crucify himself and film it. And that was what he did. There's real nails through the hands, but the feet are propped up on a block of wood so that the ankles don't get nailed or anything like that. But still, it's obviously quite a dangerous ritual to partake of.
But that wasn't what killed him. That was just part of what he was doing of his life journey.
Yeah, I would say that was his attempt to actually save himself, but he was divided in that way, and I think part of him genuinely was looking for a cathartic experience which would help him get free of his addiction or his demons, and so he literally imitated Christ. I mean, in the most dramatic fashion. But another part of him wanted the publicity, wanted to use that whole experience for his own aggrandizement, which is, very Luciferian, and that, I think, that was the part that won out. He did get famous through the crucifixion, if anything, I'd say.
Did you ever get a sense that he had maybe some of the same thoughts or obsessions with the violent sexual imagery that you had?
Yes, for sure. And I would think if he would have, I mean, they probably weren't an exact match because we wouldn't have had exactly the same traumatic experiences. But that was one of the things that I find myself unable to not explore and speculate about in Vice of Kings is what was my brother involved with that he didn't and couldn't talk or write about, including with me. I feel that he hinted about it, and that in his autobiography he wrote about some of it, but also made up other stuff that was shocking but legal, such as having sex with a what do you call it, somebody who has no arms or legs, a multiple amputee, as a shocking anecdote, which I later found out wasn't true. Made me suspect that he did other things that were true because he was pushing this path of transgression, which I think is probably a good subject to get onto, to its limits. I think he was on the path of transgression in a Crowleyan way, and that, of course, many transgressions are illegal, so he couldn't just brag about them in his autobiography. So he could only hint at them. And I don't know if there was violence against women, but I do suspect that there was some child abuse in there. And I mean, I feel very ambivalent about saying that because it may not be true. But I just feel that my brother, in a similar way to Crowley, although he claimed to dislike Crowley a lot, was driven to push the envelope morally as far as he could push it. So, why assume any limits at all? That's my logic with Crowley as well. Why do the people who defend him assume that Crowley was such a hollow braggart that he would claim to be the beast and say that his whole life was dedicated to discovering the unforgivable sin and committing it and things of this nature, and then say, oh, he would never do something like that? I mean, what sort of logic is that?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I completely agree with you. Logic says that Crowley would have no reason to brag about those things, given that his entire life was dedicated to the pursuit of that path, and it ended in ruin for him. He was washed up heroin addict, barely able to move off the sofa, and I think he died having gone through all of the family's money, as I understand it. So it's not really could you claim a path with a positive outcome? I mean, I guess looking at him as a historical figure, he's been one of the most influential figures of the last 100 or so years, and left an enormous legacy. I wouldn't say it's a positive legacy, but in terms of the social engineering of the system for the elites, he was a key player in it and played a massive role. So, if he was able to see what the world has become now, in his name, he probably would be very proud of it. But
you think he would be?
I mean, I would say so. Yeah, I think we live in a degenerate society, and things that were happening behind closed doors in his day and age are now happening right out in the open and on a mass scale. And now they've become the culture itself. That if you watch, Netflix in particular, there's so many of these Crowleyan and Luciferian values and themes that are just promoted and rammed down our throats on most of the shows.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that part. I just wonder if he wouldn't be horrified, because when we actually see the consequences of our actions, it may be too late to realize that we didn't actually know what we were doing. So
Right.
I guess I would
Right.
like to
Yeah.
give some benefit of the doubt to at least the state of the afterlife, such as it is, that we, if there is one, that we really see the deeper truths of what we were doing. And I mean, I do wonder about Crowley or many of these characters, what point what they're doing to others, they're also doing to themselves. They're doing it to their own bodies because they're doing it with their own bodies. There must be some point in which they realize that, even if it's in the moment of death. I mean, maybe I'm just being optimistic there, right? But it seems to me that one can't kill one's conscience completely, because I think the conscience isn't a mental thing. I think it's an organic thing. I think there's a natural sense of what's true and false and right and wrong, and a natural empathy and compassion in our bodies. And I think, to bring it back to the path of transgression, I think this is very central to the pursuit of power of the ruling class, that they traumatize others to gain power and to create recruits and agents and instruments and all the rest of it. But also what they're doing, maybe primarily, is they're traumatizing themselves over and over again. First of all, to get into these heightened states of consciousness, because trauma does alter your consciousness. And secondly, maybe it's the same thing seen from a different angle, to sabotage their nervous system in such a way that they become invulnerable. They no longer feel any pain or sorrow or suffering because they've killed themselves in some way. It's like trying to kill their own souls.
Right. It also makes me wonder. I mean, sort of related to that point, but it's also what you're talking about a bit earlier, like this mind virus. If there's perhaps an epigenetic component to it, that even if you didn't receive the information directly in your lifetime, it's there in your psyche and in your consciousness and in your soul, in your DNA from your ancestors and from their previous lifetimes, and just gets passed forward.
Yeah.
And something that I've always wondered about is families that do own abattoirs and slaughterhouses. Is there a karmic effect from that, from so much killing?
Mm.
And I mean, it seems like in your story and your brother's story that perhaps there is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's some mysterious way in which we are all interconnected, and that goes double with ancestry, as you say. I mean, there's even some scientific basis for this now, that trauma is passed on through the genes, through the sperm and whatnot. And so, but I do think that probably extends to the whole human organism, really. There is a human organism, just as trees are all interconnected by their roots. Um, Humans seem to be, in my impression anyway, we seem to be interconnected by some more mysterious thing, but there's a resonance between us. Whatever one human does affects all other humans. So, yeah, I mean, karma may just be a fancy word for something. Well, actually, it does just mean cause and effect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It may be that we have a very misconstrued idea of what reality is in terms of the individual. We may have actually had a trauma generated illusion about existing as individuals at all. And again, this is very much the instrumentality or the methodology of the ruling class, is they want to individuate through trauma, through abuse, through destroying everything in themselves that connects them to the collective. A false kind of individuation, that depends on abusing others and having power over others. It's very Luciferian, isn't it? It's wanting to reign in hell rather than serve in heaven. That's the metaphor. And I mean, how do you do that? How do you create a hell in in an existence which essentially is all one, which is a divine reality? How do you create a pocket of existence that can't be accessed by the divine? It's kind of impossible, isn't it? But the closest you'd get somehow would be to create some quarantine realm in which you were just constantly transgressing, you were constantly doing things that defied the deity and that blasphemed the deity, which I would say fundamentally, I mean, this is Christian, the image of the deity is Christ, is the human body. It's committing sins against the human body, with and against the human body. I think that's the overriding principle of Satanism and of the ruling class.
Interesting. And, we sort of come from this society of Judeo-Christian values. It's the idea that thou shalt not transgress, right? That we're supposed to live these clean, pure, simple, holistic lives like a monk, with no transgressions whatsoever. And then we live in this modern world where, if you cross the street, not at the traffic light, before the little man turns green, well, that's jaywalking. That's that you can get a fine. That's a transgression. If you drive your car, 5 kilometers an hour over the speed limit, that's a transgression. Or you go to use some recreational drugs. That's a transgression. And these are things that they're completely victimless crimes. You've actually done no harm to any other person from it. And yet, we seem to live in a world where there are so many things like that. And then you can bring it even further to the world of social media, where there are all these transgressions that one can make, such as, failing to provide a citation, or, making a statement that can't be backed up with evidence, or, calling somebody names as part of an argument. Logical fallacies even can become a transgression. And, rather than there being an emphasis on everyone doing good and behaving the right way, the emphasis seems to be on catching people out for behaving the wrong way. So you sort of, the overall big picture of that is that you've got a ruling structure to organise society where everyone is transgressing all the time, and then a small group of people get to administer the punishment for those transgressions.
Yeah, that's right. We have a state system which turns everybody into criminals kind of from day one, and it's even in the religion, of course, original sin, and then the supercultural class, as you say, they break the crimes that they create. And I think it's a very weird thing. It's totem and taboo, because of course those who create the laws don't have to observe them, but at the same time it's deeper than that they create laws that define the lives and the behaviors and the identities of the masses, and then thereby transgressing against the laws that they create becomes both an assertion of their own power and superiority, but also an affirmation of their own distinctness from the class that they're ruling over. So there's something, so it's like a deep psychosocial dynamic which is understood and applied for the maintenance of a hegemony, satanic, if we're going to use that word, hegemony. But there's something happening, right? Because time isn't static. Society keeps changing, and the population keeps growing, and the technology keeps changing. And so we're seeing something very strange and hard to interpret now in terms of how it's revelation of the method is the shorthand for this, but how the methodologies and the practices of the ruling elite are becoming more and more visible. So it's like they're coming out of the closet. But the way they're able to is because they've infiltrated we the people with their behaviors and their values. Like we've intuited that the way to level up is to break the laws that we're told we must not break, because that's what our rulers are doing. So we're actually inheriting and adopting these values of transgression as an expression of our freedom. So then you have, LGBT and all these, which in their essence maybe are, that's obviously a big ball of wax to get into, but in their essence, many of these values don't seem overly suspect, as in giving people having the freedom to choose their own lifestyles, but very quickly they become something else. They become a celebration of decadence.
Right. So, I agree with your point that the Satanists just seem to be coming out into the open and becoming much more blatant about what they're doing, being spearheaded by Hollywood. Do you see this as perhaps a good thing in the sense that since they're exposed, people will want to reject that? Or is it a bad thing because it's saying, well, there's no hope for us because they can do this blatantly in the open and we're powerless to do anything about it?
Well, if I had to choose as a betting man, I'm not a betting man. If I were a betting man and I had to choose, I would definitely go with the latter option. I don't feel optimistic about it at all. And I don't feel optimistic about the state or the fate of humanity. It seems to me that we have collectively, and this is very painful to consider because we may, as individuals, we may have no choice but to go along with the collective choice momentum. Collectively, we seem to be accepting the mark of the beast. We seem to be embracing the microchip to the brain uplink to the cloud that Ray Kurzweil has threatened for so many years, and really buying into the idea that despite all of these proliferating problems that are constantly triggering us into hysterical behaviors, somehow technology will save us, which is like believing that 2 + 2 = 5. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's like you were saying earlier, to distrust the rich people, but trust your government, as if there was any difference. It's just, people are not thinking in any way that's cogent, and therefore, of course, they're not behaving. So, no, I mean, my sense is that the coming out of our overlords, human or otherwise, I don't really know, indicates that most human beings have been so thoroughly colonized that they present no threat to the overlords anymore. So I don't know what that means. I mean, it seems like a terrifying moment in history.
Well, from my own experience of living in Silicon Valley and being involved with the tech industry and also Burning Man, I can say with confidence that the people who are working for big tech and are building these systems in Google and Facebook and places like that, strictly religious Christians are in the absolute minority, and they would be socially marginalized within those organizations. The majority of people are living a satanic doctrine and ideology, whether they acknowledge that or not. Many of them will just say, "Oh, we're atheists." But the Satanists themselves, like the LaVeyan Satanists, they're laughing at the idea of Satan. They're like, we might as well just create this, figure to worship that lets us indulge in our decadence and carnal pleasures, because the Christians just invented a figure to worship that restricts their behavior. But whether you believe that figure is real or not doesn't matter. Versus the Luciferians who do worship evil as a deity and possibly an incarnate deity. But that's the biggest concern for me, is that all these people, they're going to Burning Man and they're burning a massive effigy inside a pentagram, one of the world's biggest public black magic occult rituals, and then the next day they go into their desk at Google and they're building the systems that spy on us and that program our news feeds and that socially engineer us. And I can't sort of see a thing where the next generation of young programmers coming through, they're all suddenly going to be Christians and they're going to reverse engineer these AIs or train them in a different direction. I think these things are being programmed from the beginning from the Satanists. Now, the one hope that I do have, and I've discussed this before, is that if artificial intelligences start to process all of the world's knowledge, perhaps they end up being good. And perhaps they end up, understanding karma and learning the consequences of their actions. And if they, create more and more positive experiences for humanity, then the world in itself will become more positive. That's probably a naive hope, but it's sort of like the only hope at this point for me, anyway.
Well, my hope is rather less optimistic, insofar as my best hope at this point is for some sort of massive collapse or peak oil or something where just the system cannot sustain itself, and it'll be obviously a very difficult and very traumatic period for all of us, but at least this trajectory we're on would come crashing to a halt, and whatever, we'd have to pick up the pieces from there, sort of a world made by hand, as James Howard Kunstler writes about it. We just have to return to some very basic kind of living conditions. I don't know. That just seems to me the only hope, because I just can't see machines succeeding where human beings have failed.
Yeah. So, from your own experience, have you found researching and writing books to be, cathartic and to have helped you in your own relationship with yourself?
Definitely. I mean, I wouldn't be doing it otherwise, or at least I hope I would have stopped if it wasn't doing that. Um, I've had to, yeah, I mean, I've had to focus more and more on that. Not necessarily catharsis, certainly self-awareness, making my past more coherent in such a way that I can, I suppose, uncouple my present, behaviors and orientations from it. It's deprogramming. It's self deprogramming. Although I don't like to use that term because then that makes me into a machine in that metaphor. But essentially identifying the traumas, and I don't mean as memories. As I say, I mean real traumas are affect in the body, so they're sensations in the body that just keep playing endlessly, for years and decades after the initial event because we can't become conscious of them and we can't release them. So it's just constant anxiety or whatever else it might be, anger, that's coming from a threshold below the level of consciousness. And I have found that writing books around those traumas, as in looking at, well, Seen Not Seen was about movies and how I escaped into movies and took on a whole identity based on movie symbols and actors and narratives and so on. Prisoner of Infinity was about Whitley Strieber and UFOs and alien abduction, which is and Castaneda and transhumanism. So besides transhumanism, it was all stuff that I got into in my 20s. I identified as an alien abductee. I wanted to be a sorcerer. I believed I was a sorcerer, as in Castaneda's world, and so on. So I took on that, that value set. And so Prisoner of Infinity really helped me identify the traumatic imprints in that, or the way that trauma had kind of opened me up to that indoctrination. And then Vice of Kings is when I get into my own family history and Crowleyanity, which also influenced me greatly in my 20s. So what I found is that on the one hand, identifying those different elements that I've internalized and used to sort of create an Uber identity out of obviously helps me to dismantle it. But I think more importantly, it allows my attention to go to the parts of my body where trauma may be trapped without any conscious intent, as in just by thinking and writing and focusing a lot on that subject matter, things in my body start stirring up, things start waking up. And so it did. I mean, I write about it in Vice of Kings. I had nightmares and sweats and body symptoms. Things were happening at a bodily level, also with Prisoner of Infinity, that corresponded with what I was writing about. So to me, any book I write, is really just the residue, or like the shell of a bird after it's born. It's just the fragments of an eggshell that testifies that something came into consciousness through the process of writing the book. You, the reader, get the eggshells. I try to refer while writing it, this is happening, so to keep the reader in the present timeline in which I was writing it. So it's not just a bunch of information or anecdote, it's a testimony and potentially even a sort of microcosm or real-time re-experience of the process of becoming conscious of our socio-cultural conditioning through trauma, of our trauma-based identities, and releasing them and letting them dissolve, and then what comes into awareness after that.
And in this day and age where people are getting their information from YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and places like that, and it seems like the reading of books is on decline. Do you feel now that you've had a few books published, is it something that you can expect to make a living solely from?
Well, I never have done that, and I don't know if I ever. I guess there was a time in my life where I hoped I could make a living out of it. When I wrote Matrix Warrior in 2002, I thought that could be a bestseller. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is back to the meta subject, isn't it, of the virus and how the carriers of the virus get promoted, they advance in a socio environment where the virus is at very advanced stages, if that's not tautological. So I was never able, to, thank God, to become an effective carrier of the virus that would be embraced by the viral system of the world, right? Like Crowley, he was successful because what he was delivering was useful and desirable to and by the world that was being configured, right? This hell world. I've always tried consciously to go against that. And even when I tried to sell out, I failed. So I'm kind of grateful for that. Something in me didn't let me sell out, whatever that word means. It didn't let me compromise my message in such a way that it would be useful, apparently, because I've never been able to be popular. So as far as books go, well, yeah, I just never had any illusions about that. And even now, I deciding whether to self-publish a book or go with a publisher, you know, 6 to 1, half a dozen the other. There's more prestige with the publisher, but there's no more publicity, and there's more profit with self-publishing. But I figure it doesn't make much difference because I only expect to sell a few hundred books anyway at the best of times. So, I mean, I see books as like a beacon or a, you know, one of those things you fire, you fire a flare into the air in the hope that there's just a few people looking, or that one person looking will see in that moment that I fire it off. I see it kind of like that. I put the book out there. It's like doing this talk with you. There'll probably, fingers crossed, be 1 or 2 people that will hear this and will reach out to me in a way that they're really interested enough to look at what I'm involved in, which isn't really to do with the stuff we've been talking about today. That's the sort of surface. It's almost like a hobby, really. I like to study the way the world works, but my real endeavor is something else. Like I'm trying to find my way through this hell world, and you know, where's the exit, please? You know, can I leave now? That's an eternal goal. I mean, that's a goal that is going to have implications in eternity. Whereas writing a book, well, you know, that's only going to last a few decades, if that. So the thing is just to reach the right people, and that's very hard to control. Yes, it would be nice to have a bestseller and make some money and reach hundreds of thousands of people, because then you reach more of the right people. But I might also put off people. Like I don't read Deepak Chopra. I don't trust any of these guys who have bestsellers. Because I know the nature of the world and it makes me distrust them. So there is an advantage also in being very marginal, I think.
It's a little bit like the blue check marks on Twitter. You know, I've got enough public notoriety that I could probably apply for a Twitter check mark if I wanted, but I wouldn't want to have one because all the people who have them seem to be terrible.
Right.
Have you got any thoughts, Jason, for anyone who's watching this and thinking, you know, I relate to this and I would like to process and release some of my own trauma, what they could do to get started on that journey?
Right. Well, it's a very individual thing. I would say that, I mean, if a person is aware of having trauma, they're already quite ahead of the game in that regard, because most cases, including my own, we're not aware of really being traumatized or carrying trauma. We're just aware perhaps of behaviors and thoughts and patterns that oppress us. Like, why do I keep doing this when I don't want to? Or why can't I do the things I want to do? Why do these thoughts keep coming back to me? Why am I not the person that I thought I would be or that I want to be? And so on. You know, there's countless different ways in which our wings have been clipped or burned so badly that we can't fly. And that's the symptomology of trauma. And in that case, it's really a question of being willing to look at that, to go into, and to, I don't know if self-examination is quite it, but I think it's close to it, really being able to look at oneself. And in my experience, the most helpful things, besides or including even writing books, have been dialogues with others, which is why I do the podcast as I do, because I find, you know, even today, you and I were talking about a lot of big picture stuff, and we're not going into, well, I've gone into my personal life a bit, but it's not a particularly intimate conversation, but there's still the opportunity of two souls, two consciousness connecting across quite a lot of space. Actually, you're over there in New Zealand. I'm here in Canada. This, we're having an experience of a resonance or an affinity that we wouldn't have ordinarily, and I think the act of articulating things can really bring things into consciousness. So I would say that psychotherapy is probably an over-literalized or an over-formalized version of something we can all seek and find, which is kindred souls to share our experience with and to explore together. What's going on here? How did we get so fucked up? How are we so lost? Is there a way through and out of this terrain? Not as a mind game, not as a video game, but as a real heartfelt pursuit, that ups the stakes of personal honesty and vulnerability. Because without that, without a willingness to be really seen and exposed and honest and vulnerable, we can't even take the first step. So yeah, I mean, I think there's courage. Courage comes from recognizing, how many obstacles are in our way and how compromised we've been. If we're able to start seeing that, then I think potentially we find a lot more courage to be honest in that, and we can connect with people in much deeper and more meaningful ways.
What I hear in what you're saying is that it's very important to articulate things, and being able to have a deep conversation with someone is a way to unlock these things that are buried deep within you that may not be at the forefront of your consciousness. And if I could relate that to my own experiences, in my younger years when I was partying a bit, and we'd go to raves and we'd do ecstasy, and I'd sit down with my friends on the ecstasy, and it just creates this kind of safe, loving environment where you can talk about things and get it off your chest, and you feel so much better once you talked about it. And the drug was actually kind of developed and used before it was banned in the US for couples therapy and for PTSD treatment and for psychiatric counseling, and even structured sessions where a therapist would be bringing a couple into a dialogue, but the ecstasy drug was giving them this underlying feeling of mutual love and well-being that kind of encouraged them to open up more because they weren't so afraid of the consequences of speaking. And I don't advocate or condone drug use to people, but I have to be honest and say that I felt that was it played a significant role in my upbringing, and the issues that I had from my childhood and anger towards family members and things like that. I was able to just get rid of all of it just by talking it out, and not in any planned or structured way. It just kind of all happened.
Yeah, I think certainly I really underestimate how much our fellow human beings can be our allies, and then a big part of that is that we are, because insofar as we have been traumatized and negatively impacted by our childhood experiences, etc., and are living in a world that's basically geared to destroy our spirit, we tend to look at each other as fellow human beings as threats. We tend to have an automatic fight or flight reaction to each other, and that's very crippling in and of itself. So even just the act of articulating things that are deep and disturbing or uncomfortable with others not only frees us from the burden of what that is, but also deepens our sense of being able to trust each other as fellow humans we're in the same sinking ship.
Yeah, I find fight or flight is quite interesting because I understand that we have these kind of responses programmed into us biologically, but I think that in any situation in life that there are actually three options: fight, flight, or negotiate. And we have the tools for negotiation, but we're not really encouraged by society to explore that third option. And it actually takes some skills to be able to negotiate, because it's not just about articulating your point, it's about putting yourself in the other person's shoes and considering what it is they're looking for and what it is they want, and then finding the common ground where you can communicate something that's mutually agreeable. It's something that my young son has a natural gift at it, which is great to watch, and we're definitely going to encourage that in him as he grows up.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's very true. I run a thrift store here in Hope, BC, where I live, and I don't work there every day because I probably couldn't be able to handle it. But so it's constantly dealing with people, including very difficult people, or somewhat difficult, homeless, drug users, uh, and so on. And so it is a constant negotiation. I mean, if I'm behind the counter there, I can't fight or run away.
Right.
It's always a
Yeah.
negotiation, right? Um, and but I think it's a great training ground actually, because as you say, we're always in that to some degree or another. There's always some sort of negotiation, and we're always negotiating. I think what's the right distance now? You know, are they too close? Are they too far away? And in every relationship, in every interaction, we're trying to find the right distance. You know, is this too much eye contact? Is this not enough? Is this too much personal information? Is it not enough? Because everyone has their own particular threshold, really, of how much human contact or how deep a connection they need, and we have to modulate our own to fit that. And it's very tricky. It's very tricky. We're not like the birds and the bees anymore, if we ever were.
From your I guess lifetime of experience now in studying the occult and thinking about it, what would you say to people about that? Would you say whatever you do, don't read a Crowley book, or read it all but keep your distance? Or is there any other authors that you think are worth studying?
Well, I don't know how much advice. I mean, again, it would have to be case specific. Uh, I know in my case, there's a danger that I've doubled down a bit too much because I got so deep into it. And so when you pull out something like if you're an alcoholic and you finally get clear of it, you say alcohol's bad, and it's true, it's bad for you. You can't even take a little tipple, right? Because you'll come right off the wagon. Well, that's how I see occultism, that's how it was for me. I see that it's the thin end of the way. When I see an occult this or that, I see the top of a very slippery slope. If you take one step on that slope, you're probably going to go all right. I know that isn't necessarily true, because lots of people can try things out and so on. So it isn't about that. It isn't about don't read these books and stay away from this stuff. That wouldn't work anyway, would it? It's a reverse psychology that
Yeah.
attracts people more. It's more about, well, I suppose just sharing my perspective, which is it doesn't work. Sorry, it could be the flaw could be in me. I'm open to that. Same with psychedelics. I mean, if I'd only done psychedelics once or twice in my life, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be telling people they don't work. I'd say, well, they were an amazing experience, but I knew enough not to do them again. But that's a kind of impossible hypothesis, because I didn't. To me, they worked so well that I did them again and again. And only, years later, or only by the end of that, did I realize, oh my God, this isn't working. So same with occultism. So they say a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and one of the reasons it's dangerous is because it leads to harder stuff, right? So do people know when to stop pursuing a particular path? I would say that the path of knowledge inevitably leads to the path of transgression if you stay on it long enough. That's what I would say. But it doesn't mean maybe you will know when to get off it at a certain point. Say, okay, I know enough now. I don't have to start trying these things out by transgressing against the principles of nature, to try and access higher dimensions. I think the problem there is what I wrote about most in Prisoner of Infinity is that that really is counterproductive. That's what is called storming heaven in the gospel, that you can become aware of higher dimensions through psychedelics or occultism, but if you want to access them, surrender is the only way. It's not through will.
And do you have another book now that you're working on, or a concept, or do you just wait for inspiration? How does that all come about?
That's a good question. It usually comes about only through partial conscious decision, and the rest is through surrender. Just like, oh shit, I'm writing another book now. Now I have to finish it. And so that happened with the last one, which I finished recently, called Maps of Hell, Underground History of Hollywood, which is my attempt to map hell using Hollywood as the case study, and to map hell well enough that I find the exit, which would be the point that also that we or I entered into this. And so then my goal was to end it with a positive message, not just we're in hell and we need to get out, but actually there is a way out, and this is what it looks like outside of hell, kind of thing, which is very, very tricky, as you could imagine. Maybe you can imagine, I don't know. So my intent was to make it the last of books that I write about the nature of the world, because I would like to write about the nature of ourselves, the nature of an existence that isn't hobbled by the world, post-traumatic existence, right? Well, none of that makes it sound like a bad thing, but post-traumatic healing existence, really, coming into the fullness of existence. So, but I don't know what that will be, because I haven't started that one, if I ever do. But yeah, Maps of Hell is the one I just finished, and the one that I have to decide whether to self-publish or whether to, because I haven't had any luck. I thought, well, this one's about Hollywood now. That one should be easy to sell, but boy, was I naive about that.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think you've got a great hook there. Look around us. We're obviously in hell. Here's the way out. This book gives you the lifeline. I could see that appealing to a publisher.
Yeah, well, I can't really sell it as that, because that would be a very lofty promise. It's more just what I said, really. That if you get a good map of hell, then it's going to include the exit. So it's not, but that's my answer, is how to find your way out of hell is draw your own map, make your own map.
Right. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good point for us to wrap up on. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. We should continue it on the Limitless, perhaps.
Yeah, would love to, anytime.
Okay.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. What I'll do is I will try to piece together these two parts of this stream into a single video and edit out the dead bits and upload that again to my YouTube channel. So thanks everybody. Thanks, Jason.